What if, in the fog of war, a single night in a port on the Black Sea rewrote the rules of the entire conflict, and almost no one outside the highest circles ever learned the whole truth? Ask almost anyone on the street, and you will find that the name Chernomorsk triggers little recognition. That is no coincidence. What transpired there was so explosive, so potentially destabilizing, that those in power, on every side, went to extraordinary lengths to keep it hidden. Evidence was not merely overlooked, but systematically destroyed. Witnesses were silenced, their stories erased or rewritten. Official reports, when they surfaced at all, painted the event as nothing more than background noise in the endless cacophony of war. Yet, beneath the surface, the events of Chernomorsk on the night of October 19, 2025, sent shockwaves through the very heart of the conflict, setting off a chain reaction that would ripple across continents and alliances. But why did this single night matter so much? How could an explosion in an obscure port become the pivot for an entire war? To answer that, we must dig beneath the obvious destruction, a warehouse razed, equipment lost, and uncover the secret cargo, the hidden actors, and the vulnerabilities that no one wanted the world to see. Let's begin by rolling back the clock. Picture Chernomorsk in the hours before disaster struck, a city shrouded in autumn darkness, its piers slick with dew, its streets haunted by anxiety after months of conflict. The Black Sea brooded just beyond the city lights, its waves lapping at the hulls of ships and the concrete of the docks. Only a handful of people knew that, on this night, the fate of a nation, perhaps even the shape of the future world, was being loaded, piece by piece, into waiting containers. In the days leading up to October 19th, activity at the port reached a fever pitch. Convoys of trucks, their headlights masked, rumbled down rural roads at odd hours. At the main gates, security was doubled and tripled. Metal detectors and bomb-sniffing dogs became routine. Port workers, many of whom had never seen a uniformed Westerner before, now found themselves taking orders from officers speaking English, German, and even French. Some of the advisors wore no insignia at all. Anonymity, it seemed, was as crucial as security. To understand the gravity, consider a historical parallel. During the Second World War, the port of Antwerp became the linchpin for Allied logistics after D-Day. The Germans recognized this and unleashed the V-1 and V-2 rocket barrages to cripple supply flows, hoping to starve the Allied advance. In Chernomorsk, the stakes were equally high. Whoever controlled the flow of men and material through this port controlled the tempo of the war itself. What, then, was moving through Chernomorsk that fateful night? According to a tapestry of sources, leaked manifests, satellite imagery, interview transcripts, the cargo included not just ammunition and fuel, but advanced Western military hardware. There were whispers of Storm Shadow cruise missiles, their range capable of striking deep behind enemy lines. Electronic warfare suites able to scramble communications and blind radar. And perhaps most critically, components for the vaunted Patriot air defense system, the very shield that had kept Ukrainian cities from burning in prior months. Imagine for a moment the scale of this operation. Each Patriot missile battery requires hundreds of specialized parts: phased array radars, mobile command posts, missile launchers, and miles of encrypted cabling. Every box, every crate, is inventoried, barcoded, and signed for. The scrutiny is immense. Western advisors must verify serial numbers and destination forms. Nothing can disappear without a signature, a lesson learned the hard way after infamous scandals where aid vanished into the black markets of earlier wars. That night, the port was a hive of activity. Floodlights illuminated the loading bays, casting long shadows against stacks of crates. Ukrainian logisticians, their uniforms stained with sweat and stress, shouted orders over the roar of forklifts. Civilian workers, many drafted from nearby villages, moved with frantic purpose, aware that any delay could mean disaster. Eyewitnesses would later describe a tension so thick it felt like a live wire running through the dockyards. One recalled a Western officer, clipboard in hand, barking instructions in crisp, accented Ukrainian, while another monitored a laptop screen that showed the latest satellite passes overhead. Every movement, every shipment, was logged in triplicate, a bulwark against both theft and sabotage. But the very protocols designed to ensure security created a different kind of vulnerability. By concentrating so much value and so many decision-makers in one place, the port became a beacon for enemy intelligence. Russian surveillance drones, some disguised as seagulls, circled overhead, transmitting live video feeds back to analysts across the sea. Electronic signals, encrypted but not undetectable, painted a picture of unprecedented activity at Chernomorsk. This is not a new phenomenon in war. In the Korean War, the United Nations Forces supply hubs at Pusan became both lifelines and Achilles' heels. When the North Koreans pushed south, the fate of the entire theater depended on a single, overburdened port. In Chernomorsk, history was repeating itself, but with 21st-century stakes and technology. The defenders knew they were exposed. Ukrainian air defense units, many operating with little sleep, scanned the horizons for signs of attack. Their radars flickered with false positives: birds, weather balloons, the occasional civilian drone. But on October 15th, a new pattern emerged. A coordinated, multi-layered Russian strike package, designed not for brute destruction, but for systematic overload. The assault began just before midnight. Locals would later recall an unnatural shimmer over the bay, as if the very air was electrified, moments before the first missiles appeared. These were not the unguided barrages of earlier months, but precision strikes, each missile programmed to evade, confuse, and finally overwhelm the defenders. Wave after wave crashed against the shield. Some missiles were decoys, designed to draw fire. Others altered their trajectories mid-flight, weaving between interception zones. The air above the port became a deadly ballet of explosions and counter-explosions, the night sky flickering like a city-wide lightning storm. For the Ukrainian defenders, every intercepted missile was a victory, but a costly one. Each shot consumed precious munitions, each alert drained attention and stamina. The Russians were playing a longer game, sapping the defenders' strength, probing for that one critical breach. And then, inevitably, the breach came. Through holes torn in the defensive curtain, a salvo of missiles punched through and struck with surgical precision. The first explosion was monstrous, its shockwave shattering windows miles away. The second and third followed in quick succession, igniting fuel stores and ammunition dumps. The sky above Chernomorsk turned from black to searing orange, a pillar of flame visible from the outskirts of Odessa. But the true devastation was not in the fireball alone. The missiles found their marks in the command tents, the encrypted communications vans, and fatefully, the cluster of officers, both Ukrainian and Western, gathered for the night's critical audit. In a matter of seconds, the port's brain and nervous system were wiped out. The chaos that ensued defied belief. Survivors described a scene out of Dante: burning vehicles, shattered cranes, and the screams of the wounded echoing around the docks. Some Western advisors, caught in the blast radius, disappeared, missing, presumed dead, their fates classified even from their own governments. For hours, the port was a kill box, a place where every protocol for safety had failed spectacularly. Consider the broader implications. In the First Gulf War, a single Scud missile strike on an American barracks in Dhahran killed 28 soldiers and forced the coalition to overhaul its entire approach to missile defense. In Chernomorsk, the loss was not just in lives, but in trust. The very systems meant to guarantee transparency, audits, paperwork, layered oversight, were now shattered, replaced by suspicion and panic. As dawn broke, the scale of the disaster became clear. The port was crippled. The supply chain, meticulously constructed over months, lay in ruins. Convoys meant to resupply the Eastern Front were stranded, their cargoes burning on the piers. Communications were cut, leaving commanders at the front guessing at the scope of the loss. But the effects did not stop at the water's edge. As news of the attack filtered east, Russian assault groups, seemingly waiting for this precise moment, unleashed a coordinated offensive across 5 sectors. Their timing was uncanny, almost as if they had been watching the events at Chernomorsk in real time. This was not conjecture. Intelligence intercepts later revealed that Russian units had pre-positioned forces, mapped out Ukrainian supply lines, and even intercepted panicked radio traffic from the port. Their attacks exploited every weakness: undersupplied units, broken communication chains, and the paralysis of decision-making caused by the loss of Western oversight. In the days that followed, Ukrainian commanders faced impossible choices. With reinforcements delayed or missing, they were forced to abandon planned counterattacks. Artillery batteries, once able to fire a dozen shells for every enemy advance, now rationed each shot. Field hospitals, cut off from medical supplies, improvised with what little they had. Stories began to surface. A mechanized brigade, promised new engines and spare parts, watched as its vehicles ground to a halt. A frontline unit, outnumbered and outgunned, radioed for help that would never come. For every lost container at Chernomorsk, there were 100 soldiers left exposed at the front. Morale, always fragile, began to crack. Rumors of the disaster spread faster than official reports could catch up. Soldiers whispered that the West had abandoned them, that the enemy somehow knew their every move. In one chilling account, a Ukrainian captain described watching Russian drones circle overhead, dropping pamphlets that taunted, "Your lifeline is broken." The psychological toll was incalculable. In military history, the collapse of logistics has often proved more decisive than firepower alone. In the Battle of Stalingrad, it was not the German army's lack of courage, but the freezing, empty supply lines that doomed them. At Chernomorsk, the same principle was at work, except this time, the collapse was engineered through both kinetic and informational means. Meanwhile, Western capitals found themselves blindsided. Secure lines buzzed with urgent questions. How had so many safeguards failed at once? Was there a mole inside the supply chain? Should further shipments be paused, rerouted, or even cancelled? The fear was palpable. If Chernomorsk could fall, what other secrets might be vulnerable? In the search for answers, investigative teams pored over satellite images, intercepted phone calls, and forensic analyses of the blast site. Some discovered evidence of Russian cyber intrusions weeks before the attack. Malware hidden in shipping manifests, encrypted messages that bypassed firewalls. Others traced the movement of suspected collaborators among the port's civilian workforce, raising the specter of sabotage from within. But even as the investigation gathered steam, bureaucratic inertia set in. Committees were formed, blame was apportioned, and careers hung in the balance. In the meantime, the cracks in Ukraine's logistics only widened. The protocols that had once ensured accountability, multiple signatures, checkpoints, and paperwork, now became obstacles to recovery. In the immediate aftermath, life-saving cargo was stranded at the docks, awaiting approvals from supervisors who no longer existed. Trucks sat idle, their drivers unsure whether to risk the road without explicit orders. This pattern is familiar to students of military history. During the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, Indian forces were delayed by layers of paperwork and authorization, even as critical supplies piled up in depots that later became targets for Pakistani airstrikes. The lesson, then and now, is clear. In war, speed and trust matter more than perfect control. As the days stretched into weeks, the downstream effects of Chernomorsk became impossible to ignore. Frontline units reported shortages of everything from batteries for night vision goggles to medical kits for triage. Engineers, vital for repairing bridges and fortifications, found themselves improvising with scrap metal and scavenged parts. The strain was not limited to the battlefield. Families in cities far from the front began to feel the pinch. Supermarkets in Odessa and Mykolaiv reported shortages of basic goods as transportation networks prioritized military needs. Fuel rationing returned, and rumors of corruption flared anew. The sense of national unity, so painstakingly built in the first years of the war, was under threat. Yet, amidst the chaos, some adapted. Local commanders, cut off from headquarters, began to improvise. Old Soviet-era radios were pressed into service when digital networks failed. Civilian truckers, once shunned for security reasons, were recruited to run ad hoc supply runs through back roads. One battalion even set up a makeshift drone repair shop in a church basement, using spare parts from downed enemy machines. These acts of improvisation echoed historical precedents. During the siege of Leningrad, when formal supply chains collapsed, survival depended on the ingenuity of those on the ground, smuggling food across frozen lakes, rerouting power lines, and creating black markets for essentials. In Ukraine, the spirit of resilience was alive, but it came at a cost. Every workaround highlighted the failure of the system to adapt before disaster struck. At the same time, the political consequences of Chernomorsk began to unfold. In Kyiv, parliamentary hearings devolved into shouting matches as opposition leaders demanded accountability. Some called for the resignation of senior generals. Others accused Western partners of negligence, or worse, betrayal. The president, facing both internal dissent and external pressure, ordered a comprehensive review of all cooperation agreements with Nato. In Washington, Berlin, and London, the mood was equally tense. Intelligence chiefs warned of a new phase in the conflict, one where information warfare and targeted sabotage might prove more decisive than tank battles or airstrikes. Debates raged over whether to increase aid or retrench, fearing that every new shipment might be intercepted or destroyed. The lessons of Chernomorsk soon became the subject of closed-door briefings at military academies across the West. Officers studied the incident alongside case studies like the loss of the USS Liberty in 1967 or the surprise at Pearl Harbor in 1941, moments when intelligence failures and overconfidence had catastrophic consequences. In the months after the strike, Ukraine's defense establishment underwent painful reforms. Some were cosmetic: new uniforms, new slogans, and the appointment of crisis managers. Others ran deeper. Decentralized chains of command were trialed in select sectors, allowing lower-level officers to make supply decisions without waiting for approval from Kyiv or NATO liaisons. Emergency caches of equipment were established in secret locations, guarded by rotating teams loyal only to the chain of command. But the scars remained. The trust between Ukrainian forces and their Western partners, once the bedrock of the war effort, was now laced with suspicion. Every new shipment was double-checked for sabotage. Every advisor was vetted and revetted. The illusion of seamless cooperation, so carefully cultivated in press releases, had been shattered on the docks of Chernomorsk. And yet, history shows that out of disaster can come transformation. The British, after losing Singapore in 1942, rethought their entire approach to colonial defense, eventually paving the way for victory in Burma. The Israelis, after the surprise of the Yom Kippur War, built the world's most sophisticated early warning networks. For Ukraine, the question was not whether the wounds of Chernomorsk would heal, but whether the lessons would be learned in time to prevent the next catastrophe. So, what are those lessons? First, that secrecy, while essential in war, can become a prison. The more tightly information is held, the greater the risk that critical warnings will be missed or ignored. Second, that oversight must be balanced with flexibility. No amount of paperwork or electronic tracking can substitute for the judgment of those on the ground. Third, that trust, between allies, between commanders and soldiers, between nations and their people, is the most fragile commodity of all. Practical steps are possible, and some are already in motion. Decentralizing decision-making empowers local actors to act fast in a crisis. Building redundancy into supply chains, multiple routes, backup depots, trusted civilian partners, can blunt the impact of a single strike. Training programs now include simulations of logistical collapse, teaching both soldiers and civilians to improvise under fire. And, crucially, mechanisms for rapid information sharing are being piloted, so that no commander is left guessing in the dark. Other nations can learn from Chernomorsk as well. The United States, after the debacle of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, poured resources into after-action reviews to ensure that evacuation plans and logistical hubs would never again be so exposed. NATO, facing new threats from cyber and hybrid warfare, has begun to treat supply chain security as seriously as frontline defense. For Ukraine, the road ahead remains perilous. The war is far from over, and the scars of Chernomorsk will not fade quickly. Yet, the disaster has forced a reckoning, a recognition that the machinery of war is only as strong as its weakest link, and that true resilience lies not in secrecy or centralization, but in the adaptability and trust of those who fight and support. And so, the story of Chernomorsk is not merely a tale of destruction, but a warning and a call to action. It shows how, in the crucible of war, every decision, every layer of protocol, every link in the chain, can mean the difference between victory and disaster. History is written not just in the ink of loss, but in the hard-won lessons that follow. For Ukraine, for its allies, and for all who seek to understand the future of conflict, Chernomorsk stands as both a cautionary tale and a blueprint for transformation. The next chapter will depend on whether these lessons are heeded, before the next strike, the next breach, the next night when the world changes forever.